If we ask what is the relevance of history to what essentially look like philosophical questions or scientific questions about how God works in the world, I think the answer goes something like this, that what we get when we look historically at how these questions have been explored, for a start, we get a huge number of intellectual resources because people have grappled with these questions for a long time. And if we look at history, it saves us very often reinventing the wheel, because people have thought through these issues, and although we sometimes tend to think of people in the past being like us but stupider, in fact, they're not. And indeed, we see solutions to these problems being generated. So I think that's the first reason, that the past is an enormous resource for ideas about this kind, and people have had very creative and brilliant ways of thinking about it. So that's number one. The second thing I think that's important, and this is a more subtle point, is that very often I think some of the ways in which we conceptualize these issues to do with divine action or miracle or natural and supernatural, these concepts have a long history. And the history of how these concepts emerge over time also helps us understand what the underlying assumptions of the particular concepts are. So the obvious example that I've been talking about is law of nature, which we tend to think of as an unproblematic feature of the natural world. But historically, what we see is that this concept was really a fundamentally theological conception of how nature operates. And so what history would suggest is that if we operate today, if we talk about laws of nature, we have to understand whether we're still wanting to invoke the original historical assumptions that made that conception a coherent one. And so there's another reason why I think the study of history is important. And perhaps another way of putting it is, this relates to one understanding of the purpose of philosophy, which was famously put by the philosopher Wittgenstein, Ludwig Wittgenstein. He said that the task of philosophy is to leave everything more or less as it is, but when we study the grammar or how we use particular words, often we find that things that appear to us to be puzzles can be solved by understanding how the words operate. And history gives us a very long perspective about how long-standing ideas like miracle, law of nature, natural, supernatural, how these have operated. And if we understand the various historical modes in which these words have operated, sometimes things that appear to be deeply puzzling turn out not to be as puzzling as we might otherwise think.